Meng Haoran, a view of Lake Dongting for Minister Zhang Yuling. In the 8th month, the lake is at its fullest. Reflected sky and water joined in endless blue. Its breath rises like steam from the Yunmeng marshes. Its waves roll across to shake the Jueyang city wall. I would cross the lake, but have no boat or oars. I am ashamed to be idle in such enlightened times. I sit and watch men dangle fishing lines, envying them in vain for each fish caught. So this is the first of 9 poems by Meng Haoran in the section of this anthology of pentasyllabic regulated poems. As you can see, he has, a very big amount of poems proportionately in this section. He's got as many as Wang Wei and only one less than Du Fu. So we might imagine that the compiler and probably the tradition assumed that Meng Haoran excelled in this metric form, even though we've already encountered some of his poems previously in the anthology. I think it was in the pentasyllabic old style poems where we encountered at least 3 of his lines. So Meng Haoran, we've already talked about him. Just a brief reminder: he was a rather unsuccessful scholar official. He took a long time in passing the examinations, and he was never given an important position. So he very early on adopted the persona of the retired scholar official who, just doesn't want to get his hands dirty with the government and the politics of this fugitive world. A lot of his poetry is landscape poetry, and he is generally paired with Wang Wei, with whom he had a relatively good relationship. In fact, one of the poems that we will read in a couple of days' time is a poem he dedicates to Wang Wei. So, nature poet with perhaps slightly different elements. I think the tradition says that Meng Haoran generally puts the focus on a human inhabited countryside, and Wang Wei's is more of a metaphysical, empty countryside, in consonance with his Buddhist views of emptiness and so on. Now, this poem that we have just read doesn't quite match up with the stereotypical views of Meng Haoran's poetry, and as well as it should, because even though traditions and anthologies, typecast writers, so Meng Haoran is typecast as the nature poet and the retired life poet, most Tang poets wrote poems about completely different topics, which have nothing to do with what would later be assumed to be their forte. Now, this poem that we have just read is, I would say it's 2 things at the same time. It's, on the surface of it, it's, I wouldn't say a landscape poem, I would say a landmark poem. It's not so much describing the natural landscape as it is describing a famous lake in the south of China, which is, of course, a part of nature, but it's mainly a very famous lake. We've already read poems that were located or that sang about Lake Dongting and its surroundings. It was, one of the famous landmarks of the whole empire. So this poem has a part of that, especially the beginning. It seems to be a description of the beauties of the lake. But on the other hand, and already the title transmits this doubly coded meaning for this poem. This is a poem dedicated to Minister Zhang Yuling. Zhang Yuling, we've already talked about him as well, and he had 5 poems, I think, in this anthology, all of which we have read and commented already. Zhang Yuling was a very important politician, apart from being a poet. During the Tang Dynasty, he had his ups and downs, but he managed to be practically, a prime minister of Emperor Xuanzong, and he was a patron of other writers, including some of the most famous Hai Tang poets. What is more, Zhang Yuling acted as a patron for Meng Haoran. The only official posting that Meng Haoran had in his lifetime was a regional post in Zhang Yuling's entourage. During one of the periods in which Zhang Yuling was in moderate exile in the provinces, he enrolled Meng Haoran into the local administration under his direct control. So it was not a post to be achieved through the central government and through examinations. It was, an ad hoc, self and free designating post. I imagine, I don't know enough about this poem and its background, but I imagine that Meng Haoran might have written this poem just before or hoping for that post that Zhang Yuling was going to land upon him. So the main topic of this poem, behind the appearance or coexisting or being juxtaposed with the idea of describing a beautiful landscape, a beautiful area of the south of China, is asking Zhang Yuling for a job in a very polite and indirect way, as poetry is supposed to work in Chinese culture. So those are the two main topics. There is an element, perhaps, of the simple life of fishermen in the last lines of the poem, but of course it's not meant to be read, I believe, directly like Meng Haoran envying the fishermen, but rather it has a symbolic and allegorical meaning, which we'll talk about in a minute, and which is related to his asking, to his begging for a position to Minister Zhang Yuling. So as usual, let's go couplet by couplet. In the 8th month, the lake is at its fullest. Reflected sky and water joined in endless blue. So the poem starts by praising the lake Dongting at its moment of greatest beauty and splendor. The 8th month is mid-autumn in the traditional Chinese calendar. And I imagine that swelled with the rains of the summer, because in most areas of China, summer is a wet month where it rains a lot. So the lake at the middle of autumn, there might be some autumn rains, I imagine, as well. The lake is at its biggest and most splendid. And in a clear day, we have this beautiful image of an extended blue that goes from the heavens to the lake. The lake reflects the blue of the heavens. The heavens are blue. We have one big blue painting covering the whole of the cosmos. Water and air, all under the color blue. So next couplet, the second couplet, which is the first parallelistic couplet, continues with the description of Lake Dongting. It focuses on two areas in the lake or near the lake. Its breath rises like steam from the Yongmen marshes. Its waves roll across to shake the Zhuijiang city wall. The parallelistic lines are very clear even in the translation. Yeah? Breath, waves, rise, roll, Yongmen, Zhuijiang, marshes, city wall. So we continue having images of the lake. The lake seems to be slightly personified. It breathes. What is the breath of the lake? Well, in its marshy areas in Yongmen, it probably emits, this sort of misty vapor that marshes tend to emit. And this mist is equated to the breath of the lake rising. So it's something the lake is doing. It's also a vertical image, contrasted with the one in the next line, which is a horizontal one. The waves rolling across, and they shake the walls of Zhuijiang. Remember, Zhuijiang is a city that, it was just next to the lake. In fact, its entry gate tower, which we've read a poem, I think it was by Du Fu, about the sights from that tower. Yeah, I think it was by Du Fu. So the city is right next to the lake, has wonderful views of the lake, and you could say that the waves of Lake Dongting wash the feet of Zhuijiang city. So we have these two images of motion and still of beauty. Up till now, the first 4 lines, we just have a general, landscape description of Lake Dongting and its surroundings. The next 4 lines move on to the more subjective feelings of Meng Haoran and his intentions which are coded, as we said. Third couplet, which is parallelistic as well. I would cross the lake, but have no boat or oars. I'm ashamed to be idle in such enlightened times. So what does Meng Haoran wish to do? He would like to cross the lake, but he's not a fisherman. He's a retired, or well, not retired because he never really served. He is a gentleman scholar, and he would like to cross this beautiful lake, but of course he's not a fisherman. He doesn't have a boat and oars. Well, we could guess he might be able to hire or to pay somebody to land him across. And the second line, I am ashamed to be idle in such enlightened times. What do these two lines have to do with each other? Crossing the lake? Not serving in this enlightened period? Of course, the meaning becomes clear if we read this desire, this complaint at not having oars and a boat as a coded political message. It's actually an allusion. There is a text in the Classic of Documents, in the Shu Jing, in which the emperor describes his ministers, his prime minister in that text, as his boat and oars, which allows him to cross rivers. So it's a very typical idea. The ministers allow for imperial power to be extended, allow for the wishes of the ruler to be made facts. So Meng Haoran wishes to be a minister. He wishes to be the boat and oars. He wishes to serve the empire. He wishes to be of use. And with that interpretation of the lack of boat and oars, we perfectly understand now the second line. What Meng Haoran is saying is, this is a good time. He's being a bit of a flatterer. He's ashamed to be idle in such enlightened times. Confucius said in the Analects, when the rulers are good, you should be ashamed of being poor and of not serving. When the rulers are bad, you should be ashamed of serving in office. So with a bit of flattery, Meng Haoran is, telling the minister, this is a good time for ruling. The ruler is virtuous. You and the ministers are virtuous. I am ashamed at not being hired. I want to cross this lake, but I have no boat of my own. I want to serve in the state, but I have no position. So I'm asking you, to lend me a hand and to allow me to exert myself in this good age in serving the empire. The last line is very similar. It changes the simile. It still keeps with the watery images surrounding Lake Dongting, but it makes, a very similar point of view to that made in the third couplet. I sit and watch men dangle fishing lines, envying them in vain for each fish caught. So, this might be based on a real fact. I can imagine Meng Haoran being at Lake Dongting and looking at the fishermen. But again, like in the previous line, it's not like Meng Haoran couldn't get himself a fishing line and fish in the lake with more or less success. It's that he is asking for a position. The image of the men dangling fishing lines evokes evidently politicians, fishing men for office, for government, recommending or employing men. And Meng Haoran envies the fisherman. He too wants to serve in office. He too wants to be fished. And he probably wants to recommend virtuous men for office when he manages to reach office himself. So that's the poem. Not a bad poem. So a very polite. This shows you. It might not be a very majestically seductive poem, but I think it shows very well one of the main purposes and one of the main uses of poetry for scholar officials. They believe that poetry, among its uses, was meant to express what's in the heart with intention, and what's in the heart more in the form of political ideas and objectives than feelings. Yeah. So poetry had been used in the past, for polite interchanges and ambassadorships between different states, but always with this idea of, through a poem you can transmit a coded political message, and this double coding has two positive effects. It blunts the directness of just recklessly and directly asking for something. At the same time, it shows the culture, the refinement of the creator of the poem and of the receiver. One is able to create a poem in a subdued way that shows in a hidden way his intention, and the receiver is smart enough to decode the poem and understand what is being asked. And this is a perfect example of this sort of poetry interchange.